Hello, New Prospect. Welcome to RTB 2021 for January 19th. Hope you're doing well. Our texts for today are Genesis 20, then we have Nehemiah 9, Acts 19, and Matthew 19. And the New Testament, we're kind of keeping right up with the days of the week, so that's helpful to kind of remember. I know gets kind of confusing with all the different chapters that we're reading on a day-to-day basis, but hopefully you have your list to help you to kind of guide you to what chapters we're actually reading. Let's deal with the Old Testament text first, and then we'll move on to the New Testament text. In the Old Testament, we have two stories that I think are very similar in a theme. And the theme is a theme that we often see in the Old Testament: God's faithfulness in the midst of his people's infidelity. We have in Genesis 20, for instance, the story of Abraham and Abimelech. And in that story, we have Abraham repeating the exact same sin that he engaged in when he went to Egypt, right after God had called him and had brought him to the promised land. Remember that he had gone down to Egypt and he had passed his wife off as his sister. Same thing happens with this foreign ruler, Abimelech. And Abraham brings disaster on all involved, really, because of this sin. And yet, in the midst of that, God still is gracious. God still preserves Abraham and his familyness, and God is still working in the midst of this sin of Abraham. It almost prefigures the rest of Israel's history, which will be a history of God's faithfulness in the midst of Israel's infidelity. And we see that in Nehemiah 9. So this is in Nehemiah a few days after the Feast of Booths that they had celebrated in chapter 8. And here they gathered together as a people to reaffirm their covenant commitment to God, and then also to confess their sins before God. And the main sin that they confess, as they kind of rehash the history in a poetic way, almost like what you would find in the book of Psalms, as they rehash that history, which is very common as part of the covenant renewal ceremony, to remember the history of the relationship between the two individuals involved, in this case, God and his people. They remember A, God's faithfulness, and B, how they responded with infidelity, and yet God still preserved his people, even in the midst of the exile, now in the midst of the post-exile, even as the people are committing some of the same sins that sent them into exile in the first place, God still is being faithful. And that's such a great theme that we have in the entirety of the Bible, is the fidelity, the faithfulness of God, even when we falter, even when we stumble, even when as a people we stumble. And we're definitely doing that, seems like these days, as a church universal in the world. The church is stumbling in many ways, and yet God is still faithful to us. And that's always a comforting thought. When we get to the New Testament text for today, we've got in the book of Matthew, chapter 19, we've got some challenging texts. One is a text that I'm actually going to be dealing with on Sunday, briefly. As we talk about Exodus 20, verse 3 on Sunday, we're going to talk about the rich young ruler, and how that ruler had placed his affections and his worship in the things of this world, his possessions, his idolatry. And we'll talk. I won't jump the gun and talk about it now, but we'll talk about some of that on Sunday. And we also have a very difficult text here. One of Jesus's hard texts that we have in the Bible, where he deals with the issue of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And he really sets some high standards for what marriage should look like, and talks about, I think, a couple of things about marriage: the covenant nature of marriage, that this is a bonded relationship till death do us part type of relationship. It's a one flesh relationship that is reflective of a covenant relationship. And he also goes back to Genesis and grounds that marriage relationship in the original creative purposes of God. And so it shows that as a people of God, as the church, as God's people today, we need to place a high premium on preserving marriage and honoring this institution that God created for his purposes, because ultimately marriage is as Paul will tell us in Ephesians 5, It is a picture of Christ's relationship with the church, and in the Old Testament, it's a picture of God's relationship with his people. It's always been that way, and it was created for that purpose ultimately. So it's incumbent upon we as the church to teach the beauty of marriage, but also stress the seriousness of the commitment of marriage. At the same time, offering restoration to those who are definitely struggling with marriages in our world today, where it's because of sin, we see much brokenness in that area, don't we? So, wish I could spend more time on that topic, and maybe we can have a sermon or two later on dealing with that specific issue, because it is definitely important for our world today. And then finally, in Acts chapter 19, we have the story of Paul at Ephesus. This is I think one of the more entertaining stories in the book of Acts. Ephesus, of course, was one of the larger cities in the Greco-Roman Empire. And it was also a city that was centered around the worship of the goddess Artemis. And in fact, one of the wonders of the ancient world, 7 wonders in the ancient world, was the temple of Artemis. And of course, the silversmiths who were making little Artemis idols were very offended. Demetrius was one who was very offended at Paul and was losing business because Paul was converting people out of this idolatry. And there's this great riot, I guess you could say, that arises that is protesting Paul, and yet Paul is delivered through it. But one of the things I think is interesting is if you want to do this, you can look up the Temple of Artemis from Ephesians, from Ephesus. Look that up on Google, and what you will see is maybe parts of one of the many, many pillars, marble pillars that are still standing. It's broken down. It's crumbled. Here's this pagan marvel of the ancient world, and it is destroyed. And yet, what Paul was preaching, the kingdom of God, not made with human hands, that still stands. And so I think that's a great picture of the commitment that Christ has to his church to continue building it, and the things that we create in this world, the idolatrous things that we create in this world, will all crumble. So hope that's encouraging to you as we begin this day, January 19th, or finish this day, January 19th, depending on when you're listening to this. Hope you have a great one and wonderful rest of the day.